Good morning, everybody. Well, morning for me, afternoon for you, mid-morning for Dr. Barkley. I'm in California, she's in New York, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. We really want to welcome you for joining us during this session to talk about healing community trauma and some of the things that are very much challenging us today as both human beings and practitioners. So let me put my screen on here so that I can go to a smaller picture of myself and share with you our presentation. Before we start, I'd like to actually ask Dr. Barkley to introduce herself, and then I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll proceed. So, India, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having Carla and myself. As Carla mentioned, I am coming from New York, so it is morning time here as well. And I am a doctor of acupuncture with a private practice in the heart of New York City. I am also currently serving as a board member on the Acupuncturists Without Borders Committee. And I'm really delighted to be here. We have so much information to share, a lot of clinical data and our own personal experiences, and all of the research and tireless work that we've been doing with AWB. So thank you so much for having us.
And as for myself, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. I've been a practitioner for almost 40 years now, and I got interested in the topic of trauma while living in Israel, where I lived on a kibbutz, where many people from wars lived, people who had been children in the Holocaust. And so I started my trauma work there, and it's continued for the last 20 years. And Acupuncturists Without Borders has been a place for myself and people like Dr. Barkley to bring our clinical skills into a wider service area so that we can bring trauma treatment with Chinese medicine out into the world. So with that, I'd actually like to start with a very simple meditation. It's not even meditation, visualization tool that we use at Acupuncturists Without Borders when we're doing service work, because we work in very chaotic places. Oftentimes we work in disaster areas, we work in conflict areas. And so our clinical work is done in situations that are rather chaotic. And it's very important for us as practitioners to be regulated, to regulate our own chi so that we can serve our patients best. So I want to share with you heart mouth, which is a very simple technique, and I'd like us to do it together. We can do it across the world, even online, and it works. So I'd like you to close your eyes if you choose. You can keep them open if you like. I'm going to close my eyes actually, and feel your body in your chair if you're sitting, or on the earth if you're standing, or if you're lying down. Feel your body kind of sink into toward the center of the earth so that you feel anchored. And scan your body without judgment about anything other than what you note, meaning you might have stress someplace, you might have pain someplace in your body, you might feel tension, you might feel fantastic. So just scan your body and note what you feel. And now I'll invite you to breathe just a little bit deeper and a little bit slower than you usually do. Nothing big. And now put your attention in the area of your heart. And you can put your hand over your heart if that helps you focus your attention. And imagine breathing in and out of your heart. And now I'd invite you to put a picture or a symbol, a color, something that denotes gratitude for you, somebody or something that you're grateful for. Put that picture, that feeling, that color, that symbol in your heart area. And once again, scan your body. See if it feels any different. You can open your eyes. I feel different, actually. I was nervous before I did that to do this presentation. Will I be on time? Will the technology work? I don't care now. I feel regulated. I feel a little bit more regulated. And that's the point of this. You can use heart math with your eyes open. You can use it while you're with a patient who's very dysregulated, who's very anxious, who's very challenged, and they won't even know you're doing this, so that it will help you be there for them. It's also something you can teach to your patients. So if you're interested in heart math, you can go to the Heart Math Institute website. Heart math has been around for about 40 years. It's a fantastic technique. It's called quick coherence technique. So just to review it, first you do heart-focused breathing, where I ask you to breathe in and out of your heart. And by the way, coherence is the heart math word for regulation, regulating chi. And then the second step is to activate a positive or renewing feeling. I ask you to put gratitude into your heart area, because that's almost everybody can be thankful for something. It's something that people can access and resource very quickly. So again, heart focus, heart breathing, heart feeling. That's quick coherence technique. And we use it all the time. So now I'd like to talk to you for a minute about Acupuncturists Without Borders and what we do. We call ourselves AWB because Acupuncturists Without Borders is a really long name. So I'm going to say AWB from now on. We really believe organizationally that trauma is often foundational to suffering in the world, both at the individual, community, familial, and even national level. So this is why we focus on working with trauma, preventing trauma, reducing trauma, healing trauma, because ultimately our overarching mission is to create more support for creating peaceful communities. And in order to do that, we have to interrupt trauma cycles that foster conflict, that foster suffering. And through our work, we aim to provide hope and build resilience in the communities that we work with, to empower them through the tools that we have in Chinese medicine and integrative medicine to feel more in control of their destinies and their well-being. On an organizational level, we strive to create programs that are sustainable so that we may start something in partnership with people in a community, but we want that community to really take it and have it work for them, they be in control of it, and have it be sustainable for their community. We are always working with local partners and in collaboration with others. And we do this by providing direct services. By direct services, I mean providing treatments directly in communities that disastrous events or experiences. And we also train people. We train practitioners to do this work in the communities that they live and work in. And that's really how we have a big impact as a very small organization. We can't go to every country or every community that needs us or needs Chinese medicine for trauma healing, but we can train practitioners like yourselves to do it where you live and work. So training is a really important part of what we do. So as I mentioned before, we work in disaster zones. We started 15 years ago. That's how Acupuncturists Without Borders began. after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And since that time, we've worked on hundreds of disasters, both in the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, and internationally. So here's just a few photos from different disasters we've worked on. On the left is wildfire relief in California, where I live. Wildfires are now not just a seasonal disaster, they're all year round almost. And so we do a lot of wildfire relief work in communities impacted by fires. In this top middle is work in Puerto Rico that we did after Hurricane Maria. We did a lot of direct service there in collaboration with NADA practitioners and people who were practicing in Puerto Rico already. And on the right top, this is also California fire relief. We work a lot with first responders, firefighters, and other first responders who work in disaster zones because they need support in order to do their work. They're often awake for 24 hours for days. And even just getting one treatment in the course of their work is really helpful for them. The bottom middle is Las Vegas after the big concert shooting several years ago. And as many of you know, we have a lot of problems with mass shootings in the United States. We've had 2 in the last month, which are heartbreaking. So we often work in communities that have this experience, and we work with everybody who's affected. Bottom right is, I believe, Hurricane Harvey in Texas a number of years ago, which was another huge hurricane. So this is these are examples of where we work in disaster zones. We also, on the sustainable programs part, we help practitioners create ongoing community service clinics. And so before COVID, we had about 40 clinics across the United States where we served refugees, veterans, combat veterans, farm workers, again, disaster and violence survivors, first responders, people who do not have homes. And during COVID, some of that work was paused because of quarantining and lockdown. And now that's really been resurrected. And we're doing many more projects again in different communities, and particularly in the refugee communities, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then finally, we work internationally. We started working in Nepal in 2009, primarily with children and women and men who have been trafficked for labor, organs, and sex, and factory workers, women factory workers. You'll see on the left, this is a group home for children who have been trafficked, and we do a lot of work with ear seeds with children. Nepal is a place where the practitioners there, they come out of the Tibetan medicine tradition, and they make their own ear seeds. So it's a very easy place to work with Chinese medicine, with East Asian medicine. Top middle is Palestine. We work in Israel and Palestine, which is obviously a conflict area. And so our work there is really to think about how communities can be better regulated so that they can actually communicate and work toward a more peaceful coexistence. On the top right is also Israel. Middle center, or bottom center, is Haiti, where we've worked since 2010 because of the big earthquake there. And Haiti's seen many, many, many more disasters since that time, including in the last year. We have an ongoing program there for 12 years, and we've trained a lot of Haitian practitioners to do this work. And then finally on the bottom is Nepal again. This is after the big earthquake in 2015. And I think we did 60,000 treatments in the 6 months after the big earthquake that year. And we work in Nepal still. And finally, training practitioners, like I said. This is really how we expand our capacity and our work. Right now, we work very closely with a group of midwives in the Refugee Health Alliance in Tijuana, Mexico, where we have many, many people on the Mexico side of the border who are refugees and migrating people from Haiti, as well as Central America. And we work with the midwives there who deliver almost all the babies in the refugee community in Tijuana. They've all learned NADA in our trainings with them and other kind of GYN related simple acupuncture, moxibustion, and herbal strategies. And what's great about working with them is they have their own indigenous herbal medicine. We have an integrative herbal pharmacy with Chinese herbs as well as Western herbs and indigenous herbs. It's a fantastic pharmacy. So that's what we do. We use somatic therapies like acupuncture in our work, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. So I'm going to hand it over now to India to talk. Oh, no, that's not true. I'm going to be doing our trauma part first. I forgot that. So I'll keep going. Nope, that's not true. You're doing it, India. I thought that maybe we should do the other section first, but we're doing this one first. So forgive me for that little blip. So
Thank you
India,
so much.
take it away.
Beautiful. I can keep your screen, or should I?
You can just advance it yourself because you're a co-host.
Beautiful. Okay. So, okay. I'm assuming you can see my screen now, right? Beautiful.
Yeah, just put it on slideshow so it's big.
Got it. Okay. So why we are here. So this is now the incentive to introduce trauma-informed care, and global trauma affects individuals, it affects families, it affects nations, and it obviously affects our planet, as we've just seen here. So I'm sorry about that, bear with me. So what we'd like to do here is to introduce trauma-informed care as an opportunity for us as practitioners to support our communities and to have a system of doing so. And so we are obviously in this grave need of global trauma, and all beings are being impacted presently in this sphere of trauma. And the current use of personality of trauma means that healing work is more important now than ever. And so we would like to introduce this sphere of trauma-informed care. So now moving on to the COVID pandemic, which we are all experiencing. And the COVID pandemic has affected us all in ways that we probably won't understand for many years to come. So it's not so much just the disease of COVID, it's this ongoing uncertainty of, where do we go from here? And it's the revelation of social infractors brought into high relief by COVID that has caused deep despair. And so the physical illnesses and the death that have come about, the inaccessibility and the inequitable health care that is now amongst us in COVID, the extended isolations that many countries are experiencing, and the distrust in science and government is also breaking down community. And all of this contributes to our individual and collective trauma as we move through this pandemic. So anxiety is at an all-time high, depression is at an all-time high, insomnia, anger, disassociation, there's an increase in drug use, and suicide is also escalating. So it might be that the pandemic will eventually bring the world community into a new type of reorganized state where we're coming together to create solutions and find ways that we can repair a lot of the dysregulation that is amongst us. So we really have to take all of this and take heed and realize that we need to come together to create some new structural change and also bring trauma healing into this equation. It's why we need trauma-informed care more now than ever with everything going on with the COVID pandemic. So we are presently experiencing war and conflict in 40 official zones, okay? So this is 2021 statistical data. So there is presently a need for trauma-informed care in various diverse areas. And so beyond COVID, many other factors contribute to trauma that is experienced by millions of people around the world. There's war and there's violent conflict happening in these zones. And so the ongoing residual impact of war being present in these areas is going to eventually need some kind of response or solution. Another reason why we would need to bring some type of trauma-informed care into our communities is human displacement. So currently there are over 82 million people displaced by war, by poverty, by violence, and by climate change. We have the displacement of over 82 people worldwide, refugees, migrating people without status, asylum seekers facing repetitive traumatic events. And all of these are due to issues like war, drought, famine, poverty, death threats. And these are just some of the issues that they face. And so all of this is going to add to the traumatic journeys that people are experiencing, and this ongoing forced displacement and lack of national status is also causing a lot of trauma in the bodies of people. There's also an issue with poverty and resource inequity. So poverty and resource inequity means that almost 700 million people around the world live in extreme poverty. Half of humanity lives on less than $5.50 a day, okay? And our world's richest 1% have more than twice the wealth as the rest of the world, rest of the 8 billion people in the world, that is. So research has shown that the long-term exposure to income inequities can have a direct impact on mental health and health as a whole. We have the issue of social injustice around the world, especially here in the US as well. And so social injustice is this kind of systemic issue. It is including things like incarceration of Black and brown people, misogyny, hatred of non-binary people, sexual violence, genocide against minority religious and ethnic communities, systemic bias in employment, healthcare issues, housing issues, education issues. All of this keeps the patterns of trauma ensuing. And so there's a wonderful quote here by Ruth Shim and Sarah Vishen that says that to achieve mental health equity, we have to dismantle these issues that are pervasive within the social injustice aspect. Another thing that we'd like to highlight is this climate change and disaster issue that we have and that is ongoing. So climate change is going to be one of the pressing issues of our time. Climate devastation and increasingly destructive disasters are threatening our communities with environmental degradation, extreme weather patterns, disruptions in our harvesting, depleted fisheries, hurricanes, extreme changes in temperature, fires and floods, and we can kind of continue on that path. But the toxic environmental conditions are creating barely livable conditions for many people, and particularly in these countries that are undergoing rapid industrial development. All of the change that we're witnessing has the potential to erode the livelihoods and threaten humanity. And so again, we're seeing how these changes take on a devastating impact and have a residual impact in lasting trauma. So the ACEs study, which some of you might have heard of, is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And this can have a tremendous impact on future violence and victimization and the perpetration of such. It can also affect the lifelong health and the opportunities of those impacted by ACEs. So ACEs are anything from what you see displayed here, but it could be extreme violence experienced in childhood, sexual abuse, ongoing neglect, substance abuse, abandonment, physical neglect. All of these can have a devastating impact on children and their lives and their potential futures. Almost half of kids in the US have had at least one ACE experience, and more than 20% have had at least two. So just imagine how this is going to have a residual impact with all of the events happening in the world. As Carla just mentioned, we've had two current events that involved shooting, and one of them was with an elementary age population. So, you know, these experiences, these adverse experiences are going to have a lasting impact and are definitely going to be a cause for trauma-informed care. So HIPP is an acronym for Historical Intergenerational Pervasive Systemic Personal Trauma. This was coined by Auresma Menaken, which is a writer, he's a thinker, he's a teacher, and he has created this wonderful groundbreaking work centered around racial trauma and healing. This term HIPP was coined, and it is a guidepost for us to better understand how to be informed in the domain of trauma. So HIPP informs the physical and emotional ill health of entire communities and nations over many generations, transmitted genetically, socially, and psychologically. So we're seeing how through the intergenerational aspect of the exposure to trauma, how that can be ingrained within the DNA and be carried over generation after generation. So for instance, the genocide experience in indigenous populations, in slavery, experiences that we've had in the Holocaust. These are all collective traumatic experiences with accumulated experiences over time that can adversely impact subsequent generations. And that really stays within the bodies of individuals that we're finding that, I know I can speak personally that clinically I've had patients within the BIPOC community that have had experiences of being scared or poverty stricken experiences that really weren't lived experiences, but there's a tendency to be fearful of them. And again, this is speaking to this theory that it is intergenerational and it's due to the pervasive systemic aspect of certain traumas. So we'd like to offer a distinction and a definition of stress versus trauma. So stress is a physical, mental, or emotional factor that causes physiological or psychological tension. One of the things that's most important to understand here is that stress can be resolved. We can recuperate from a healthy amount of stress. So stress is in fact a mechanism that the body can kind of cope with. Trauma, on the other hand, has a lasting impact, and the lasting physical and emotional effects of an event that is actual or perceived can be a life-threatening experience in the bodies of individuals. So sometimes this is an accumulative experience over time, and exposure to chronic toxic states, stress, or systemic oppression can be perceived as very life-threatening in the individuals. So the effects of stress are much more reversible, and that's the key point here, whereas trauma has more of a lasting impact. So as a trainer, you can be equipped with how to identify these in the bodies of people. So some examples could be holding a crying baby, when a pot of oil spills over, or the phone rings, or sometimes when the door is ringing. These triggers and the responses to those triggers in the bodies of individuals can give you an indication as to whether or not there is a residual stress response or a residual trauma response in the body. So to further define and to further expound on this context of trauma, we'll refer to our Elaine Duncan, who is one of our lovely directors and cohorts within AWB. So post-traumatic stress disorder, which you all should be familiar with, PTSD, is this static idea. It's a term that really is the experience of stress, and it is very defined. Trauma spectrum response is more dynamic and allows for a broader explanation of the physiological and psychological experiences that people are having. So TSR, as explained by Elaine Duncan, is an expression of an energetic system that has been stimulated beyond a particular individual's ability to cope. And we're talking about their physiological capacity, their psychological, or even spiritual capacity. So now we have a highly disorganized system that's simply awaiting the restoration of natural balance and equilibrium. So it really is in this vulnerable state of trying to grapple with some type of normalcy because it's so highly dysregulated and disorganized. So these symptoms can emanate from the body, they can come from the mind, they can have an effect on a multitude of systems, including the cardiovascular and the neurological system. This impact can have an effect on the digestive process, how the person responds in terms of their immune system. This can show up in the musculoskeletal or fascial system, or even the endocrine system. And that's where the spectrum comes in, that trauma really can be colored very differently in different bodies. So survivors may suffer psychologically, they may suffer emotionally, there may be a spiritual distress, and our ability to recognize that is really important as opposed to just a stress response. So many experience various states of these somatic responses. And over time, this can be a more chronic pattern if there isn't any intervention of some kind. And so we utilize a lot of our somatic therapies, acupuncture, Reiki, touch work to kind of be a intervention of sorts to allow for a person to find more regulation within their system. So post-traumatic stress, PTS, is a psychophysical condition. The brain and system change physically. It can happen in response to life-threatening events or cumulative toxic stress. So symptoms appear usually 4 to 6 weeks after exposure, but they usually don't get better with time. So there's 3 categories of symptoms that we can look at. There's the hyperarousal, there's the isolation, and then there's the re-experiencing aspect of those symptoms. So all of this increases with physical proximity and cumulative exposure and personal history, and it looks different according to how those are uniquely showing up in the individual. PTS also has a debilitating effect on families and communities. So there is a ripple of how PTS shows up with the individual and how that individual relates to their community. The brain and metabolic system change, and all of this will now function differently when they're exposed to trauma. And again, this includes changes to the nervous system, to the endocrine system, to the immune system, and so on and so forth. So neuroscience seems to be the means in which we're using research to better understand how human beings adapt biologically to stress during the developmental stage of how they're actually being exposed. So the latest research, which we use the term neuroscience, covering neuroscience, epigenetics, the ACEs study, and resilience. So these are different areas and different domains that allow us to have some understanding of how human beings adapt biologically during stressful events. This explains why the ACEs studies has so much impact on public health, the safety and well-being. Epigenetics findings are helping to help us understand how the environments are playing a role and how groups of people seem to have more challenging generational impact. And this can kind of give us a sense of how that residual is following through. In terms of the ACEs study, as we mentioned, this is providing us new ways of thinking and how to help us understand powerful preventative systems that can support people through their course of life, understanding the root cause of stressors. So all of these are, sorry about that, all of these are tools in which we're gripping a better understanding of how stress is developed through time. Resmaa Menakem has a beautiful quote that states, there may not be anything wrong with you. Something may have happened to you and your people. And this is really received by my patient base, because sometimes they really don't understand why they have these tendencies to be really sensitive or emotionally aroused in the presence of certain stimuli. And so sometimes it really is deeper than just the surface identity of a person, but it's more of a genetic tendency or predisposition because of inherited intergenerational traits that they may have acquired. So again, this is just re-emphasizing HIPP, created by Resmaa Menakem, this beautiful book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racializing Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. So again, this book is really covering the notion of how historical trauma presents itself, how intergenerational trauma also shows up in terms of symptoms and embodiment. It's also exposing this pervasive systemic aspect of trauma. And so this personal infliction really is giving us insight on how the differences in terms of how people respond to trauma situations. And so psychologically, we need to be more informed as practitioners. We need to be more informed in terms of how we can approach our communities with resources such as the one provided by Resmaa Menakem. So this is here for you to take a picture of or just make mention in future references. So the trauma-informed approach realizes the impact of trauma. We are recognizing signs and symptoms in our patients, in our clients, in families, and even in our staff. We respond by integrating our knowledge into the practice and being more informed in how we approach care. We're also resisting and resisting the ignition of re-traumatization. And so systems without trauma sensitivity, we find are part of the issue of why we need this trauma-informed approach. People are sometimes labeled as pathologized, but we need to focus that there is nothing particularly wrong with the person, that there is in fact a root cause for why these sensitivities are present in the bodies of our patients. And I think we are just now going to hand off to you, Carla.
I think you have to unshare so that I can now share again. And actually there was one last slide there, but I can take it, India, on the principles of trauma-informed care, but I'm happy to.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Okay. Hold on, I'll bring it up for you and you can talk, okay? How's that?
Great, perfect.
Hold on. Let me get back to the right slide and then I'll put it on the full screen here. Thank you, everybody, for your technical patience.
Yes, I see here. Okay.
There we go.
So
nope, that's not it.
Much. No,
that's not it. I'm so sorry. Okay, wait.
Okay.
I'll get it. Just a minute.
Take your time.
All right, let's try again. Oh, there we go. Okay. How's that?
There we go. Beautiful. Thank you, Carla. So in summary.
I'm sorry. I don't know why this is happening.
Do you want me to try?
No, just we'll just keep it. Well, you know what? We'll keep it on without putting it on.
Okay, perfect. So in summary, there are 6 trauma-informed care principles that we'd love to leave with you today. We've got safety and security. We need to understand how important it is for our patients, for our communities to have a sense of feeling safe and secure. We recognize that this space and this mental and perceptive recognition really allows the body to be receptive to the modality that is being offered. So really creating safe situations in terms of the actual environment and space where treatments are offered, but also within the therapeutic rapport between you and the recipient. And so this is really fundamental to how to approach trauma-informed care. Trustworthiness and transparency. So again, there needs to be a feeling of trustworthiness, and that connection between you and the patient is necessary, and a level of transparency is also necessary. Remember, these individuals have been inflicted with really heightened states of trauma, and their systems are really just trying to navigate and better understand what is safe, who to trust. And so your unconditional transparency and your ability to just really hold space for whatever it is that they need a clear understanding on, whether it's the modality that you're offering, why you're here, why you're offering the type of care to them, that really lends itself to a system that is going to receive the therapy. And again, this is an informed way to approach traumatic bodies. Cultural humility and responsiveness, so as the work that we do with AWB, we're traveling all over the globe. And so our ability to be sensitive and to have cultural humility and respond to our differences culturally when we're going to communities where women and men share different arrangements, or there's different times in the day for spiritual practices. Really important for us to honor that and integrate that into how we approach care. So our culture humility and our responsiveness to the different cultures that we're treating and we're offering our healing somatic work is necessary and is actually part of the care that we offer. Compassion. I'm certain everyone here is compassionate and loves what they do, but compassion is definitely something that is detectable and is actually felt. So allowing your compassion to really come forward and be at the forefront of how you approach care and someone who's been inflicted with trauma, and your dependability, your ability to be there and to really hold their hand and for them to feel that dependability within you is also very crucial to how you approach your care providing. Collaboration, empowerment, and choice, also very important. We want to also include our community members, those that have been impacted, the larger family and social dynamics within the trauma spheres. And so we want to work with communities to let them know that they are also a part of the healing process. And it also empowers them and makes them feel that they're a part of the momentum of moving forward into a healing direction. Giving the community's choice, giving the individual's choice in how they want to be treated, very crucial in the inner workings of how trauma treatment is received. And last but not least, resilience and recovery. And this notion of resilience, I would say, is definitely on the part of us as practitioners and our sensitivities to the resilience capacity of the patients that have been trauma inflicted. They're in a recovery place. And so just admit that person. We need to acknowledge that resilience is going to take time, and the resilience that we carry, we can extend that forward to support the recovery process of our patients that have been inflicted with trauma. Okay, Carla.
Okay, great. Thanks, India. We'll try to go more smoothly on I'll try to go more smoothly on the slide advancement here. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk about science now. I'm going to go off screen just because I want to make sure I have the ability to look at my notes and provide full info, but I'm here. So I'm going to go off screen just so I can read my notes occasionally in some of the parts that are a little more technical. I don't want to forget any information. So I'm going to go off video, but you'll hear my voice. Here we go. And let's see if I can get this from here. It still doesn't do it. Okay, we're just going to go back to, for some reason, clicking current slide, Ricardo, doesn't work. So I'm just going to go back to what we just were doing. You'll get to see the whole normal view. I don't quite know why. Maybe at the break we can fix that. Okay, so. Nope.
Carla, can I offer any help?
We're still in the start slide.
I'm sorry, what?
For some reason, we're still seeing the start slide now. So
I know. I know that I'm doing it correctly. So are you've definitely stopped sharing, right? India?
Yep, it says you are viewing Dr. Carla's screen. So
okay, so every time I press on, very interesting. Let me see.
Stop your sharing of the screen and restart it again.
Yeah, let me do that. Let me do that. There we go. Okay, we're just going to use it like this.
Looks good.
Yeah, and if you want to reduce your screen, you'll see the whole thing, even though it's not a full screen view. Okay, or if you want to reduce the gallery. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about science, like I said, to talk about how trauma imprints and trauma patterns develop in the body. The biomedical, or quote unquote Western view of trauma response is a really big subject, and it involves understanding neurophysiology and memory formation, how we're wired to respond to threat on a nervous system level, and what happens metabolically as a result. As India said, this is a psychophysical condition. So a lot of things change in the body over time in response to traumatic experience. It used to be that trauma was really seen as a psychological problem. It was a stigmatized kind of status that people would have. Weak individuals, vulnerable individuals would be psychologically damaged, and that was the view. That's not really true now because, again, neuroscience, imaging, MRIs, and research have shown us that trauma patterns are really actually physically based. So we're going to look at how the nervous system responds to threats so that you may have a better understanding of what happens in the body and why trauma patterns become physically based. Just a little bit of review of the nervous system, because I'll be using some terms that most of you know, I'm sure. But let's just do a quick review. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord nerves, and the peripheral nervous system includes nerves outside the brain. and spinal cord, and they act as a neurological relay network between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system includes nerves that exert voluntary control of muscle movements, like if you wanted to go running, via the skeletal muscles. Most of the cranial nerves that emanate from the brain are part of the somatic peripheral nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system exerts involuntary control over the smooth muscle and glands and organs, as the name implies. It works autonomically without a person's conscious effort to maintain balance or homeostasis. So the autonomic nervous system controls things like metabolism, digestion, urination, bowel movements, blood pressure, sexual response, heartbeat, and breathing rate. And then we will talk about the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, in just a minute. And just as a kind of quick review, the sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for the flight or fright response during any potential danger. It's one part of the autonomic nervous system, and the other part is the parasympathetic nervous system, which inhibits the body from overworking, and it helps restore the body to a calmer or more coherent or regulated state. We've used those words before. And so these are the two major parts of our autonomic nervous system and are very operative when we're working, when we're bringing acupuncture and other somatic therapies into the treatment of our patients. So it's a little hard to see here, but you can see the differences in this diagram between sympathetic and parasympathetic activities. So sympathetic stimulation on the right-hand side will do things like dilate the pupils, increase the heartbeat, relax the airways, and tell the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline so that the body is ready to respond to a threat. The sympathetic also inhibits certain metabolic activities which will waste essentially the resources of the body in threatening situations. So it'll shut down things like digestion to sequester the energy so that you can have a more aroused response to the stress or threat. And then meanwhile, on the left, the parasympathetic nervous system, when it is stimulated, it does the opposite. The heartbeat slows down, the pupils constrict, and organ activity reactivates because the body is calmer and can resume regular functions like digestion and elimination. So to summarize, the sympathetic nervous system arouses response, and the parasympathetic nervous system calms it down. So let's just talk about the brain for a moment. We're going to start with the limbic system, which is the collective name for brain structures that are involved with motivation, emotional processing, and memory. It's really a collection of structures. And you can see in this diagram, it's really in the center of the brain. It's like the core or the most protected part of the brain in certain ways. It's in the middle, it's in the center. It's not to the outside of the brain. So it's our very kind of core primordial system, at least for the brain. And it consists of a bunch of structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, cingulate gyrus, amygdala, hippocampus, and basal ganglia. But for the purpose of today's conversation, we're going to focus on the thalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, and how they're involved in emotional formation and processing, as well as the storage and activation of emotionally associated memories. Because actually, that's how traumatic memories are stored, with these structures working and changing in the brain. So all of our sensory experiences, such as being able to see, sound, taste, smell, and touch, the senses are the stimulus. They're the stimulation they stimulate the limbic system. And except for smell, all the sensory input, what you see, what you hear, what you touch, what you taste, is routed to the thalamus first, which is located deep in the center. You can see the center there within the core of the brain. And the thalamus is like a big distributing station. It distributes information to different parts of the brain so that you can perceive what you're experiencing or what that sensory input is. The amygdala is very close. It's at the core of the limbic system and is very involved with emotional processing, especially the emotion of fear. And interestingly, the amygdala, when it gets a lot of blood supply, which is what happens when you have a threatening experience, you're biologically wired this way, so that blood goes to the limbic system and the amygdala, particularly that activation then activates the endocrine and autonomic nervous systems, preparing the body to respond to stress. So the amygdala, when it gets a lot of blood, sends information to the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline so that you can run away or fight, and as well as cortisol, which helps you break down fat and glucose so that you have something to respond to the threat with. So think of the amygdala as a major emotional processor, and it helps then send messages to the rest of the body to respond. The hippocampus, which is the kind of green, long, horn-shaped structure in the picture, is involved in forming, organizing, and storing new memories, as well as connecting emotions and sensory information such as sound and smell to archived memories. It's like I'm sure you've had the experience where you smell something and suddenly you have a vivid memory that maybe you haven't had for a number of decades, because the smell activates that archived memory of your experience, say when you were a child. The hippocampus acts as a memory indexer, and it sends memories out to other brain structures for long-term storage and then retrieves memories when necessary. So think of the hippocampus as a big storage center or a library, a memory library. So to summarize the primary processing relationship of these three structures, the thalamus, the amygdala, and hippocampus, the thalamus is the distributor. It distributes information throughout the brain. The amygdala processes information emotionally and then commands the body to respond. And the hippocampus indexes and stores the memories. The other non-limbic system brain structure in our conversation today is the prefrontal cortex, and that's in the front part of the brain. So this is the analytical center of the brain. It's responsible for evaluation, rational processing, of executive function, and impulse control. So just a note here that when you're not in a traumatized moment or when you're not responding to a threat, the blood flow in the brain is relatively even. In other words, your frontal cortex is getting blood, the limbic system's getting blood, all the brain structures are getting blood flow. When you face a threatening situation, all the blood goes to the limbic system. And the frontal cortex, which is that evaluative center, that analytical center, the processing center, does not have any blood flow or very little blood flow. It essentially shuts down. So processing is not possible, okay? You can't process what's happening to you easily because the part of your brain that's involved in processing doesn't have enough blood flow. It's all in the limbic system, helping you respond to the threat autonomically or automatically. So part of the restoration of blood flow to the brain that acupuncture can provide, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is to even out the blood flow again so that the frontal cortex can work. And when the frontal cortex gets enough blood, it turns off the amygdala, that emotional processing center, so it's not overactive. And you have a more calm system, a more regulated system once again. I want to talk a little bit about the vagus nerve, actually a lot about the vagus nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves that emanates from the brain. It's the 10th cranial nerve. And a little bit about the anatomy. There are two primary branches of the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve is very involved in threat response, which is why I want to talk about it. There are two primary branches of the vagus nerve, the ventral, or the more anterior, and the dorsal, or the lower, more posterior. So the ventral vagal branch affects the upper body. You can see that in this schematic. You can see that there's innervation of this, the lungs and the heart and the upper part of the body above the diaphragm. It also innervates the face and actually the ear, which we'll get to in a minute. So these are the parts of the body that are used in social interaction or social engagement. The parts of the body that we use to interact with other people. The ventral vagus is involved with most aspects of social contact and pleasure. So it guides our eye contact, hearing, eating, speech, singing, nursing a baby, kissing, smiling, and some would say that direct heart-to-heart contact that we can have with other human beings or animals. It's really called the social engagement nervous system. This is a term that was coined by Stephen Porges, who developed the theory of polyvagal theory, which we'll talk about in a minute. And because of its role in connecting people, the ventral vagal branch function helps us feel safe if we're in a relatively supportive environment, okay? So if you're scared of flying, for example, like I hate to fly, but if I look around in the cabin and I see that people are relaxed, that ventral vagal, which is activated, I'm reassured because other people are calm. And so it helps to be, I can feel that reassurance, even if it's not spoken, from other people in the cabin. Or say, my loved one who's sitting next to me, who's saying everything's fine and it's a lot safer to drive than it is to fly. And then I can calm down and I don't feel like I have to run out of the airplane or get out of there. So this is the ventral vagal system down-regulating the sympathetic nervous system. It's calming down that over-aroused response from the sympathetic nervous system. But it can only really work if there's actually a modicum of safety present, okay? It has to be a relatively safe environment for the ventral to do this. If there's prolonged danger or severe stress, this actually shuts the ventral down and the dorsal takes over. And I'll talk about that in a second. What happens in long-term traumatic exposure is that cumulatively the vagus gets deactivated. And so this impairs its development. And part of what we try to do with acupuncture is to reactivate the ventral. We'll talk about that in a minute. The dorsal part of the vagus nerve, which you can see down here, it innervates the lower middle jiao or lower jiao organs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines. It regulates everything, the organs below the diaphragm. And it's instrumental in activating the shutdown of the body when the person is overwhelmed, okay? In severe traumatic experience, where it's an overwhelming experience, the dorsal takes over, the ventral stops working, there's no reassurance possible, so the dorsal takes over. And this is how we're biologically wired. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this is a much older part of the nervous system. When that ventral part of the vagus that enables us to socially engage is overwhelmed, then the dorsal branch takes over and the body shuts down. And this is called freeze or faint or fawn. Okay, fawn meaning like playing dead, because sometimes that's the safest thing to do in overwhelming trauma. Pretend like you're dead. So this reaction has a spectrum of experience in the body. You can feel like your muscles get really tired all of a sudden and you get lightheaded, and then you kind of go to faint. You actually faint because the vagus is shutting down the body, and it can move us into both physical immobility and disassociation, like shock. We literally leave our bodies. You can say your consciousness leaves your body, or your spirit leaves your body, or you're having amnesia, but you disassociate from your body. And that's so that you can survive. We're wired to do this. So if the threat is overwhelming and the dorsal takes over, it can stay turned on. And so people, for example, who have heavy duty post-traumatic stress or trauma spectrum response that is seen as like they're really out of their bodies, they're disassociated, they're depressed, etc. It's because the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve is still the most active part of the nerve innervation to the system, and the ventral is not working. Again, I just want to say that we're wired to do this biologically so that we can survive. The problem is that sometimes these survival mechanisms aren't so selective. They don't get turned off. And you don't go back to the baseline of regulation or coherence. So that's where our medicine comes in. Again, I mentioned Dr. Stephen Porges. He developed polyvagal theory and in the mid-90s. And it's a very helpful lens through which we can look at the threat mobilization response. So just to take you through it quickly, in this cartoon, the bottom green block of this cartoon represents the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. So again, when we're in a non-threatened state, the ventral branch of the vagus nerve is active and dominant, enabling us to engage socially with other people. And it helps us feel joy, curiosity, connection to other human beings. Our digestion works, our immune systems are working well, and we can play and rest. When something frightening happens or we're threatened, the sensory information, remember we talked about it coming into the limbic system, and the thalamus distributes it to different parts of the brain. The sensory information alerts our sympathetic nervous system to go into higher gear so that we can respond to the threat. So in the pink section of this cartoon, you'll see that the arousal level increases. We feel anxiety, fear, and anger, possibly. The sympathetic nervous system elevates the heart rate and our blood pressure. It actually increases oxygenation to our cells so that we can run away or fight off the threat. That's what the cortisol does, actually. And the ventral vagal branch is still operational, but it's less in control than in the resting state. And then if the threat is overwhelming or we're unsuccessful in running away, if we're overwhelmed, the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve takes over and it downregulates the sympathetic arousal. So this is illustrated in the top blue section of the cartoon. The parasympathetic actually takes over so that we can shut down emotionally and physically. But it's like an overreaction of the parasympathetic. It's not the relaxation that acupuncture brings with the parasympathetic. It's an overreaction in order to shut the system down for survival. So the heart rate slows down, the blood pressure drops, we conserve physical resources like insulin to stay alive. We disassociate, we numb out emotionally, and we either freeze or faint or go into shock or seeming paralysis. And at this point, the ventral vagal branch is dormant. It's not activated. If the threat response is incomplete or unsuccessful, the dorsal branch continues to dominate. So it prevents a return to the physical and emotional balance or coherence or regulation. So the goal of our treatment, any kind of somatic or physical treatment like acupuncture, is to help the body return to greater ventral vagal activity so that the person can once again feel grounded in present time and engage in the world. That's really the goal of somatic treatment. And this is also why, unless this happens, and we'll talk about it more, unless this kind of physical intervention happens, the processing emotionally cannot happen, or it doesn't happen easily. And this is part of why talk therapy, if there's no somatic or physical intervention in the trauma pattern of a person, doesn't work that well. They need to be combined. They work well together. So now we come to ear acupuncture, okay, or we're getting close to ear acupuncture here, because the vagus nerve, interestingly, has a branch that goes to the ear. Okay, so when you do ear acupuncture, which is one of our primary tools when we're working with trauma for lots of reasons, and Dr. India will talk about that. What you're doing is you are stimulating the vagus nerve directly, and it can self-regulate. It will self-regulate, okay, with the stimulation. There's different auricular protocols that we use, but in general, ear acupuncture works so well because the vagus nerve has a branch there. You can see the nerve innervation in the ear on the right. Okay, so now I want to talk, I'm going to go away from the biomedical view, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5-element or energetic view of trauma patterning. Like, how do we look at trauma from through the lens of Chinese medicine or East Asian medicine? And I will refer you to Elaine Duncan's book, The Tao of Trauma. It's a great book, and it's about this topic. It's about looking at trauma from the perspective of biomedicine and 5-element thinking. So just like there's 5 elements, there's 5 steps in the threat response. So, and when I say threat response, the self-protective, biologically and energetically intrinsic response that we have in our bodies. So when we experience a threat, our first response, or the first phase, which you can call the metal phase or the lung phase, is to be startled, okay? So this is when the lung, or the Po, the animal spirit, as it's described in TCM, is stimulated, and we first become aware of a threat, okay? And we stop and we're ready. We may not even know what we're experiencing, but we get goosebumps, or we just have a feeling that something that we need to respond to something. So that's when the metal element is active. And then we enter what's called defensive orienting, okay? We feel or fear something more tangible, and the kidney is engaged. Now the water element is activated. And we are quickly exploring our self-protection options, okay? How are we going to take care of ourselves? How are we going to handle this situation? It's not a cognitive process with a lot of frontal cortex involvement, because there's no time for that, but it's still a defensive orienting phase where biologically we're trying to figure out how to respond. And then thirdly, we actually mount a self-protective response, okay? And this is the wood phase of the threat response, because wood is dynamic and it enables us to act and grow and expand. So we're using the dynamic action power of the liver to run away or fight. And if we can't succeed, we collapse, okay? We go into freeze. Once the threat subsides, okay, the fire element, the earth element, can help us with the completion of the process of responding. So the fire element, the heart, the earth, help us both go back to a calmer state, a more regulated state, and the earth element, the spleen, helps us integrate or digest the experience, because that is the nature of the spleen of earth. That's once the heart, the fire element, has helped us to become better regulated. And so we can then integrate the experience. And finally, we return back to the normal lung function, which is what we call exploratory orienting. Okay, that's again, the ventral is back. The ventral part of the vagus is operative again, so we can engage in the world and we can connect to other people and move on with a more regulated behavior and perception. So I want to talk about an incomplete mobilization response. Okay, this is when you're not able to go through the steps that I just described, where the heart can't downregulate, the fire element can't downregulate your system, and you can't integrate with the earth spleen element. Because it's in this situation, the threat is so overwhelming that you can't finish your mobilization response. Okay? So we're wired for mobilization. And if we can't complete the response to the threat when we're threatened, then the balance of the autonomic nervous system function and our ability to digest the experience is really dysregulated. And then we're really vulnerable to developing a trauma pattern that is ongoing. We might have unpleasant memories, but we don't necessarily develop an ongoing trauma response. But in a situation where you can't have a complete reaction or mobilization and completion of the mobilization response, then it essentially you get stuck in the arc of the response, and you can't downregulate and you can't integrate, and then the trauma pattern becomes more embedded. So on an energetic level, what's happening is the threat is overwhelming, so you can't run away. You can't fight successfully, okay? And in this situation, the kidney energy collapses and you go into freeze, or you go into, the dorsal takes over. The dorsal part of the vagus nerve takes over. Our kidney chi collapses, and it sends a message to the heart that death is imminent, or that's the perception, okay? And then even though the threat may subside, the threat may go away, but we didn't finish our process of responding. And so essentially that response is thwarted, it's incomplete. And so the traumatic experience can mirror the phase that we're in the response where we get stuck. So this is why you'll see a diversity of patterns, trauma patterns. They won't look the same in every person, because people are essentially getting stuck in a phase of the mobilization response on an energetic level, and the symptoms they develop will mirror that phase of the mobilization response. So to be a little bit more clear about it, so if you're stuck in a phase in the kidney phase of the dysregulation, you're going to have fear as a very strong element of experience in the trauma pattern. Whereas if you're stuck in the mobilization response where you couldn't really respond with action, like you couldn't run away, you couldn't flee, which is what the liver helps you do, then often you will show rage as your primary pattern symptom. The heart phase is where you will really see more of a sadness. Stomach, spleen, again, more inability to integrate. And stuck in the lung phase is more the grief manifestation of a trauma pattern. So here Elaine Duncan says on the left, the dramatic disorganization of energy or chi caused by traumatic stress will primarily manifest in one of these 5 distinct constitutional or personality types. So just to go a little bit more specifically, so if you see a person with a trauma pattern where fear is the predominant presentation, the eyes never stay still. They're always scanning, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fearful agitation. That's more of a kidney type of trauma pattern. Okay, so you would think about working with the kidney in terms of recovery and treatment. Whereas again, like I said, anger is more of a liver trauma pattern. So anger or a collapsed lack of capacity for being assertive. Okay, it can be the excessive version of liver, which is incredible anger or rage, and it can also be the absence of appropriate anger. Okay, it can be the deficient aspect. And usually that will be a depressive type of presentation. Person will be more depressed or internalize the rage. So that would be a situation, that kind of trauma pattern, you'd want to work with the liver. With the heart, again, sadness. If the person is just like unbelievably sad all the time, you would want to work with the heart. If the person cannot integrate their experience or digest it, like they are spinning and like, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, and there's no integration of the experience, that's a place to work. That kind of person needs some work with stomach and spleen. And again, grief would be a place where if you saw a lot of grief in your patient, you would think about really supporting the lungs. And this is a simplistic description, but I think it brings greater individuality to the treatment if you can see the primary emotional or energetic pattern that the person is in terms of your trauma treatment work. Okay, I'm almost done here. I just want to talk for a minute about the relationship between the brain and the heart. In Western culture, we tend to think of the brain as the big controller. At least I would say that's true in quote unquote dominant American thinking, that the brain is what it's all about. But that's actually not physiologically true. And it's certainly not true in Chinese medicine. And this is something where if you look at the heart math research, you can see the science base of this. The heart itself is actually gives more commands to the body than the brain. And it makes sense because if the heart doesn't beat, nothing works. Okay. And so the heart is really the center of the being on a functional level. And so in our medicine, we think about the heart as the monarch or the emperor. And it really is the primary governor of our function on a physical and energetic level. So if the heart is dysregulated or damaged, then the rest of the body is as well. And the messages that are going from the heart to the brain are dysregulated. And so we also think about that relationship between heart and kidney, okay, kidney being the ruler of the brain. We have that concept in Chinese medicine, both theoretically and clinically, where we're always trying to re-regulate that relationship between heart and kidney. Otherwise, people have a very dysregulated they can't sleep, they have heart palpitations, they're often anxious, all the kinds of symptoms of trauma, actually. And then when you think of it, when you are threatened or when you are exposed to something frightening, where do you feel it in your body? You don't feel it in your head. You feel it in your torso, your heart, or your stomach area, typically. That's where you feel the threat first. That's where you really feel it. And then you process it in the brain. But the actual experience, embodied experience, happens in the heart. And so when we're working with trauma, we have to work with the heart. This is really the idea of trauma in Chinese medicine at a very basic energetic level, is that the qi of the heart scatters when there's trauma. And so our job is to help restore the whole, to repair that shattering, or at least help initiate the process. you can see here, this is actually a heart math slide. On the left is the heart, dysregulated heartbeat, okay? And what that makes you feel, okay, is very different than if you're in a regulated heart state, essentially a heart variability rate, which is the measurement on the right, and you feel very different in your body. So in treatment, we really think about the heart. So how does acupuncture regulate or create coherence? Acupuncture modulates the blood flow in the brain. It takes it away from the limbic system and to the frontal cortex. That's one of the things that we talked about before. So acupuncture literally does that. And MRIs or imaging has shown us this, that when they've done imaging studies primarily in the military medical system in the United States, where a person with a strong trauma pattern, you can see on the MRI where the blood is going in the brain. It's going to the limbic system. It's going to the amygdala. The amygdala is overactive, no blood in the frontal cortex. And then when you put needles in, the blood flow balances. So we know this happens. Acupuncture is all about regulating blood flow. And it's through that regulation of the electromagnetic function in the body that acupuncture provides, that creates that regulation of the blood flow. Acupuncture balances that sympathetic parasympathetic response so that there's more coherence. It inhibits the amygdala from stimulating the adrenal glands. So it turns off the adrenaline. And it helps produce endorphins, which help reduce pain. And pain and trauma are very interactive. They're very interdynamic. Trauma will elevate pain levels, and pain will elevate trauma levels. And what's beautiful about acupuncture is it can work to help with both. So if you help with pain, you're helping to reduce trauma and vice versa. So on a very general level, acupuncture helps change trauma patterns. And when I say acupuncture, I'm also thinking about other somatic therapies, physical intervention therapies, which help either stop the cascade of events that create physiological changes, or helps the body restore regulation so that healing can happen on a physical level and processing can happen. So not just acupuncture, but all somatic therapies, they regulate the system through electromagnetic conduction so that the major organs can work well. That helps then enable processing of the traumatic experience. And this is where, doing acupuncture and then having a person work with a counselor or a therapist or a somatic experiencing therapist is a really useful combination, because people can do the processing once they've actually been regulated physically. Acupuncture helps you feel more like yourself, whatever that is, more like yourself. And it's done in a safe healing environment. And this is really important. A traumatized person has to feel safe. India talked about that as like the first principle of trauma-informed care. And since isolation and disassociation is part of the picture in traumatic pattern, having acupuncture, especially if it's in a community setting, which we'll talk about after the break, is really a way to reconnect people, to bring them out of their isolation. Helping, just connecting to a practitioner or people in the community acupuncture situation is very healing. I've included this just because this is data. This is research from the Veterans Administration in one of the big polytrauma centers in the United States that, all of the military medicine system in the United States started studying acupuncture more aggressively after so many combat veterans were returning from the wars that we initiated in Iraq and Afghanistan. And people were having really high post-traumatic stress levels, and there were no good treatments. The drugs weren't working, the counseling wasn't working. So they started looking at integrative medicine practices like acupuncture. And here you can see, this is from a while ago, and there's been some new data, although it's not published yet, to show this, that if you look at this qualitative research, you'll see it doesn't list post-traumatic stress, but it lists a lot of the symptoms that are involved in post-traumatic stress, like trouble sleeping, energy levels, irritability and anger, concentration, depression, anxiety. And so if you look in the second column under yes, somewhat, you'll see pretty high levels of improvement, reported improvement in those symptoms among the many people who were studied. I think the study was 649 individuals in the study that had full body acupuncture, and 890 had group ear acupuncture on a regular basis. So the research is pretty compelling. Final thing I want to say is that in treating trauma, after the break, we're going to talk about how we do that clinically. You want to take a titrated approach, okay? You can't unwind trauma overnight. Again, because especially if there's physical changes in the body, it takes a while for that to unwind. And so, you have different treatment principles depending on the phase of trauma that the person is in. So on the biomedical level, if you're doing acupuncture in acute trauma, when something's just really happened, what you're trying to do is interrupt the cascade of chemistry that creates these physical changes. You're trying to restore the cortisol facilitation, reduce the adrenaline. You're really trying to prevent a physical imprint from happening from the metabolic changes. So in that situation, the Chinese medicine approach would be to calm the Shen, move the blood and qi, okay? Whereas in a more chronic case where people say have been, in systemic trauma cases, or people who were in wars and they've had 50 years of PTSD, that's a different phase. There's much more petrification or embedding of the trauma pattern. So in that situation, biomedically, you're trying to do things like actually decrease pain and decrease adrenaline and actually increase cortisol, because cortisol gets depleted over time when you're in a trauma pattern. And from the Chinese medicine point of view, you're trying to work more with the root imbalances where the trauma is stuck, which we referred to before, like if it's more of a liver pattern, or if it's more of a heart pattern, more of a spleen pattern, and you're dissolving phlegm, clearing heat, draining damp, nourishing yin, tonifying qi and blood. So just like trauma will look differently in different people who are on a spectrum of response, the treatment will also be diverse. And that's the beauty of our medicine, that we can really individualize the treatment. Acupuncture and trauma. So when this is probably the only slide you need to remember in all of this presentation, at least of the physical, the biomedical part and the neurobiology part. So if there's a threat, then the body, mind, and spirit become dysregulated. So then we need a somatic or a physical intervention to essentially stop that cascade or that response and to re-regulate the body, okay? Then when the regulation is more complete, when the regulation to the physical body is restored, you can actually process what happened to you. You can emotionally process it. The frontal cortex can actually evaluate what happened and start integrating it. And then you have much more hope, ability to problem solve, the resilience increases. And again, we'll talk about this after the break. Community acupuncture really helps amplify the regulation provided by acupuncture and makes this possible. So basically, Dr. India is gonna do our next section, which is on the clinical tools that we use for trauma healing.
Wonderful.
So
thank you so
take it
much,
away.
Carla. Thank you, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. And we will revisit questions again once we close out for today's presentation. So feel free to bring any questions or concerns you have for the close of today as well. So I'm going to come off here, as you did, Carla, to also allow access to notes. So bear with me here. And hopefully you can see, let me just come into this field, and here we are. So we are now moving into the tools that we're using for trauma healing. So as we've talked at length about utilizing acupuncture, that is one of the main modalities that we work with through AWB. And that's what you see here pictured being utilized in the form of auricular therapy, which brings us to the many somatic therapies that you can employ for trauma healing. So as practitioners, most of you would already have interacted or come into contact with some of the therapies that you have here, but this is what we would create as an actual list of what we would term somatic therapies for traumatic healing or for trauma healing. So there's yoga, meditation, qigong. Those modalities are definitely active in that the recipient is engaging and they are utilizing an integrative aspect to their bodies with the guided yoga, meditation, or qigong teaching. There's also drumming and dancing, like we just did, as was described by, sorry about that, as was just described by Carla. Drumming, dancing, singing, these are all movement-based therapies that, again, they're helping to regulate us, and they're giving us this increased sensory awareness to integrate our emotions and our systems. So drumming, dancing, singing, these are also very culturally based, and it kind of it lends us into having a deeper understanding as to why these activities are part of cultural events as well, because there's actually something very therapeutic to them. So we also like to bring those into healing environments. Then we have the modalities of a somatic experience, or cranial sacral work, or Reiki. I myself am a Reiki master and practitioner, and Reiki is definitely one of those very deeply somatic, embodied, hand touching, hand engaging experiences that, again, allow a person to become more sensory aware. And so we really like to use these therapies to create what's called a bottom-up approach. Most traditional therapies are top-down, which is using more of the traditional way of talk therapy to get through the system, to regulate it. A lot of these somatic therapies are a bottom-up approach. So we're really reconnecting and realigning the body with the therapy so that we can move through the actual guidance of regulating the system. So essential oils are also a means of doing that. Flower essences, herbs, all of these are an invitation to integrate the body as part of the guided healing. And again, this is very different from the traditional model of talk therapy that we've become accustomed to in dealing with trauma. There's that somatic connection that is really necessary for allowing some of those survival mechanisms to kind of calm down and shut off to some extent. All right, so ear acupuncture. Why do we use it? When do we use it? And when we use other treatment protocols. So ear acupuncture is very democratic in the sense that everyone gets the same 10 needles with very few exceptions. And we let the patient's bodies do all the regulating. So we really have this very generic, effective, well-researched protocol. And what it does is we allow the employment of this protocol to work with the body, to allow the body to do the necessary adjustments. So the medicine is, in fact, it is the patient, and your body takes what it needs from the intervention and it sorts out and re-regulates. Okay, so we allow for a lot of spatialness to be there in this treatment protocol. So same as meditation, there's no specialness about auricular therapy. We really employ this therapy to allow for a process, a somatic touch-based process, to introduce an opportunity to re-regulate. Another really neat thing about auricular acupuncture is that when done in group healing, as Dr. Carla had mentioned, is that it can be a very empowering experience to be a part of a almost symbiotic healing space, because it does not require an intake form, any rigorous process of gathering information before treatment. It works for clients who don't speak English, who are maybe impaired in hearing or have a disability, those who are unaware or unwilling to discuss or talk about their problems. So we can really bypass a lot of that need that is necessary for a traditional place of treatment therapy. So what happens is that the chi of the group has a very special power that can be different from the traditional one patient interaction that you see in a care providing environment. So there's really something about the group dynamic that lends itself to a kind of a symbiotic relief. The other thing about auricular acupuncture is that it's a nonverbal modality. One important aspect of this protocol is that it's non-performative and it's non-pathologizing. So when everyone gets the same treatment, the same 10 points, patients don't have to tell the truth about how they feel. They don't have to really delve into any specifics. They don't have to give us any rigorous past histories or deeper backstories. The same treatment works as well for people who are ashamed to tell you the truth, ashamed to tell you the horrific things that they've gone through. And so it's convenient. It's really convenient and applicable in so many environments. So whether you're treating a small group or a lot of people, it is a treatment that is very adaptable, and especially one that is needed in very chaotic situations in like a disaster relief scenario. Another really neat factor is that it is a safe and simple protocol. So auricular acupuncture has been proven. There's very few contraindications, very few side effects. You can't make diagnostics mistakes with this. So this protocol is pretty straightforward. So you don't have to worry about misdiagnosing. And so this really is, again, lending itself to an ease in terms of the application of a particular modality in traumatic scenarios and situations. The other thing about auricular acupuncture is that it's portable, right? So really easy to mobilize. We can utilize the needles. We can bring our kits to different environments, and it's really easy to work with. There really isn't a complex treatment need in order to employ auricular acupuncture. So it really makes the treatments very manageable in a disaster type of scenario that doesn't really have systems set up for relief. Okay, so we can really come in and offer this protocol in all situations. It's cost effective. So we estimate about $10 a treatment with everything included. That is the office, the start time, the administrative costs. A lot happens behind the scenes to make this possible, but it is indeed still very cost effective to bring this in these types of acute situations. Auricular acupuncture is also a very gentle modality. The needles are very small. They're often very shallow. And, you know, they're going into both ears, but there isn't a lot of points being utilized. So it's a very adaptable protocol that can be sensitive to those that may have a needle phobia or just be, new to this type of modality. It's very, very gentle. We also have the application of ear seeds in the event that we can't use needles, or for some reason someone absolutely does not want to use needles. We're flexible in still having a non-invasive option of using the ear seeds. So when do we use auricular acupuncture? So usually it's in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And we use the NADA protocol, NADA protocol, which is exclusively what we employ. And there's very rare circumstances where we bring another modality to the response of a disaster. So when we use it with other treatments, it's usually in situations like a veterans clinic where we may use the NADA protocol with perhaps battlefield acupuncture. Some clinics opt to use other points as well, and that is truly up to that clinic to employ the use of NADA in addition to other supplemental treatments. So it really depends on the environment and the audience that you're serving. Acupuncturists may also resist the simplicity of NADA, and speaking as an acupuncturist myself, you may want to employ NADA as a base protocol to regulate the system, and then there may be a need to supplement with other points. So acupuncturists may want to do a different or extra points. There are circumstances when other practitioners may want to use a different point or find tremendous value in other adjunct modalities. But we realize that auricular acupuncture is a really effective modality, somatic therapy that can really come in to a disaster type of environment with ease in terms of being a practitioner. So let's talk about the NADA protocol, which I am assuming most of you do know about. So in this section, we'll talk about the auricular ear protocol, historically, where it's come from, how it's currently used in terms of trauma treatment. And we'll talk about the NADA 5 needle point protocol. We'll briefly talk about battlefield and the 12th point for restoration and balance. And so these protocols for pain and anxiety, from my understanding, are used and currently developed in the UK. So what is the NADA 5 needle protocol? It is a standardized ear acupuncture protocol of up to 5 needles in each ear. Okay, so it's a symmetrical treatment. Usually done in group setting because it's more effective, and there's a symbiotic healing that goes on with the group treatment. We use with other therapies, as we mentioned, there could be battlefield acupuncture or adjacent therapies. The other list of somatic therapies can also be used depending upon the environment and the needs of the clinical setup. It's safe, it's affordable, it's easy. It really helps to restore the balance and calms the patient, calms the recipient, reduces pain, helps with sleep and emotional dysregulation. We've seen this time and time again with the usage of this very simple protocol, that it's able to be effective in this way, in engaging with the body and actually performing these actions. Needles and ear seeds are effective, point blank. So, why reinvent the wheel if it's working? And so, as practitioners and being out in the field applying this protocol, we've seen how beneficial it has been. And the ease of setup is also very efficient in terms of trauma settings. So the origins of NADA come from a very grassroots level. We look to the Young Lords and the Black Panthers of the 70s, which is when this actual system was developed. Back in the late 1970s at a recovery center at the Lincoln Center Detox Hospital in the South Bronx, there was literally a community of activists that have come together to address the needs of the current epidemic of the opioid crisis happening in that era. Treatments were provided daily on a walk-in basis from 7 to 3 p.m. And it was really a community effort. And it was the community itself that kept this engine alive and running. They were seeing about 100 to 200 clients a day. And the Lincoln Hospital developed the first NADA training program for incoming healthcare practitioners wanting to also be active in the response to the crises going on in the 70s. So this was really the groundwork for how community practitioners and how activists as a whole can respond to a societal need in terms of healing trauma. And here are some wonderful photos of the NADA being applied in the field in real time. So we have it being applied on sweet little children in Nepal. Here is the clinical setup in Greece. So as you see, it's the notion of trying to make this medicine come into the environment of the recipient and not really bombard with its own structure and its own setup. We're really trying to bring a level of comfortability and ease to this modality so that we can foster healing. Here we are in Haiti applying the NADA protocol. As you can see, a grandma's holding her could-be grandchild or neighborhood child. So again, there isn't any particular environments. This can be done outdoors. This is a very adaptable system of treatment. The patients are sitting up. They're not needed to be in a treatment bed. Here we are in California, in the USA, also applying the NADA protocol. So here is the actual protocol itself, the 5-point protocol that all of you may have heard or have come across in your studies. So we have the 5 points, that being the sympathetic, the Shen Men point, the kidney point, the liver point, and the lung point. And these are all going to be described and cross-referenced as elemental points with the exception of the sympathetic point. And the treatment circle also serves as a healing contributor in that it is representing the earth element and supporting that stability, that integration that Dr. Carla was talking about that is also needed for re-regulating the system. So the sympathetic is the reset, right? And so that point, as you can see here, and I won't really get too much into location, point location. You can do that on your own. But there is a system of how you want to needle these. So they are needled in order of how you want to insert the needles. So we want to put in the sympathetic first to really go in and communicate with the system, with the nervous system, right? It's almost like a doorway or opening up the door. And we want to kind of reset the body, let the body know that we're coming in to offer re-regulation. We'll come into 2 with Shen Men, which is the fire point. And so then we'll lead into the water point, okay? And that's going to be the kidney. And these are all corresponding to our 5 elemental principles. Liver will also be applied as the 4th point, the wood aspect, and we'll culminate and we'll summarize the treatment with 5. So you're kind of coming in this almost infinity kind of symbol. And again, this is the order in which you want to approach the NADA protocol. So going into just the actual auricular field, the deeper and darker concave areas are really sort of fostering more of a yin treatment, which is allowing ourselves to go into the deeper dwellings of the root causes of some of the mechanisms that have caused and led to dysregulation. So again, you can always come back to this protocol as a reference, but we just wanted to give you some of the point location and the elemental references so that you can at least get a better understanding of how it's employed. So some other protocols that may be incorporated would be that of battlefield acupuncture. The battlefield acupuncture protocol for pain was codified by Colonel Richard Nimsow of the US Air Force. And this system of needling is really to attenuate to pain, right? So here we have a different series of points. We're using the Shenmen, which was borrowed from the Nada, but we have the integration of the cingulate gyrus, the thalamus, the omega-2 point, point 0, and also Shenmen. Point 0 is also a re-regulator and a resetter, very similar to the sympathetic point. So again, this is outside of the NADA protocol, but if you are interested, we have information that we could provide in terms of how to also learn the battlefield acupuncture as well. So we can offer a free AWB online training if you are interested about NADA or would like to learn more about it. It's a 2-hour NADA review. There's a demonstration on the NADA protocol itself, provided via video, and also how to apply the ear seeds. The ear seeds, remember, are an option if needles or the usage of needles is an issue when you're trying to respond using acupuncture or acupressure. We can also show you what battlefield and acupuncture and scalp acupuncture for trauma would also look like under our AWB online training. So there's our website if you're interested in pursuing more information about how these actual modalities would look and be applied in a trauma care setting. And here we have Elaine Duncan again. So she's our point of reference for the 12 points for restoration and balance protocol. AWB has an online course for this protocol as well. It's a 2.5-hour online course that teaches acupuncturists and practitioners this particular modality, and it's an auricular modality to treat trauma. And then there is a step-by-step instruction and demonstration on the approach of how to actually execute. So this is going to teach you basically more in depth on the neurobiology, the physiology of the traumatic stress response, as Elaine Duncan explains and talks about in her books. And it also relates to our 5 elemental corresponding understanding and the model of Chinese medicine as it relates to how the body responds to trauma. You'll also learn how Elaine Duncan explains how the person's response is very unique in terms of the trauma response and how there is a spectrum of different symptoms that the body will display based on their constitution, their history, and the state of time of the traumatic response. So this all shows how post-traumatic stress is not the same for each person. In fact, not a disorder responds the same. No disorder really responds the same, but in specifically speaking to trauma, it's really important that we as practitioners are able to identify the difference in how the trauma, how the threat or the shock is showing up in the bodies. So here is a quick reference of this very complex auricular protocol, 12 points for rest, restoration, and balance. And again, I won't go into any depth about it. If you're interested, we can provide you information on how to take the course. All right. So Elaine Duncan also talks about the high 5 points. And oftentimes, again, depending upon the setting of the care that we're providing and setting up as a response to disaster relief or trauma, these 5 points can be used as a diagnostic if you have a point locator. And what you will be detecting is the level of sensitivity at these areas. So the high 5 that Elaine Duncan speaks of is Shenmen, sympathetic, the external hippocampus, the insomnia 2 point, and the master cerebral. So again, this is a point of reference if there's room for a more diagnostic space. These are the points that you can use. And again, Elaine Duncan talks more about them within her 12-point restoration and balance course curriculum. As you know, scalp acupuncture, even the 8 extra meridian treatments and the internal external dragon treatments are different types of additional acupuncture approaches that can also accompany nada. If there's time and space, you can also incorporate these treatments. As we know, we have zones and meridians and different types of energetic landmarks that can also support the overall therapy in providing a treatment care protocol. And I would love to know if anyone else later on has heard of these modalities as practitioners. I'm sure Dr. Carla and I can expound more on them for you. As we've talked earlier, you can also apply botanical medicine for trauma. This really does invite other sensory experiences to allow the system to come out of the heightened states of dysregulation. So applying herbal medicine, offering tea tinctures, essential oils, flower essences, and homeopathy. These are also very, very much needed in the spaces of traumatic spheres. So botanical medicine for trauma is definitely something that is a really good adjacent modality that can be incorporated while doing nada. And so I really just want to place an emphasis that, while someone is applying needles, there could be another therapist that's offering teas, allowing the essential oils to be fragrantly inhaled, while treatments are being done. So there's a way to blend these therapies and allow it to be a whole experience within the community circles that are being created. We also have the energetic practices of Qigong, Tai Chi, meditation, yoga nidras. Let's not forget that these guided practices are also a way to integrate the sensory awareness of a patient, bringing them back into their body and out of the heightened stressful states that they're in. So we would definitely encourage, if you have a level of expertise or level of comfort in these particular energetic practices, to also guide a patient into Qigong, prescriptions, I like to call them, or Tai Chi moves. Meditation, breath work, and yoga nidras can also be a point of reference in allowing the patient to be engaged and interacting with you, again, to guide them into a more calm and more regulated place. So I love this picture here. Emotional freedom technique. So EFT, this is a very simple self-tapping system that patients can use for self-regulating and stress reduction. So again, these are all clinical tools, right? You don't have to use all of them, but we want you to know that they do exist. And these are all things that you can bring out of your toolkit to help the patient regulate and to reduce stress. So the EFT, again, is this really powerful self-active, engaging treatment that you can use to guide your patients. And basically, you're just tapping yourself, right? You're tapping yourself in certain zones that has a very powerful therapeutic, even cathartic effect. The patient can keep their eyes closed, they can keep their eyes open. And again, the tapping sequence has a certain order as well. And so we've kind of highlighted here how that would look on some level, but we just wanted to let you know that this is another modality that is definitely appropriate in the space of trauma healing and as a tool for trauma-informed care. And again, we can guide you through some of this and how it works, or give you more information about EFT and how it's employed. So therapeutic touch, right? So we're obviously here to learn about trauma-informed care, and the mode of transmission is therapeutic touch. So healing touch, compassionate touch, therapeutic touch, Reiki, another type of therapeutic hands-on healing, cranial sacral work, somatic touch. These are all additional clinical tools that can be used in a space where trauma has been ensued. So again, I can offer some personal clinical information about how Reiki has been used and how I actually use Reiki in the bodies of those that have been inflicted with some form of trauma. So Reiki is a Japanese lineage of healing, of touch therapy, and it is very much a hands-on healing, can be a hands-off approach as well. The Reiki system allows for the patient to be fully clothed, which is great, making the treatment modality very adaptable, very flexible. They can be sitting up or laying down, whatever is convenient or whatever is applicable. And the practitioner is using their hands and they're guided by the universal energy to where these zones are most needed on the patient's body. There is an actual direction of where the hand and placement should go according to the chakra system. And so the engagement with touch on the person's body, and there is some breath work that's also accompanied with the actual Reiki practice, really allows this treatment modality to be very therapeutic in nature. Cranial sacral work, somatic touch, all of these modalities are a way for a patient to be disarmed through touch, through your therapeutic touch. And so we just like to also allow you to use these and incorporate them as this kind of whole picture when approaching relief from a trauma-informed place. All right. We have another picture here, and I think I am at slide 70. And I think I'll turn it to you, Carla.
Yeah, if people want to take a picture of this slide, this one, these are just some books that we recommend if people really want to go in depth in looking at how East Asian medicine, Chinese medicine works with trauma patterns. So these are some of the good books that we recommend. Okay. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about, let me see if I can really do this again. Nope, it's still not working. Oh, well. I want to talk for a minute about working with trauma survivors. So I'll put my screen on here. Okay. Okay. So in our practices, we are trained typically to ask many questions when we're working with our patients. And if you're a 5-element practitioner, you're even trained to ask, things like, what color do you prefer? Or very, very specific questions. And what makes one of the major differences between working with a patient in your office, for example, that may be coming in with a back problem and asking many questions about their history and what happened to them. When you're working with trauma, you have to essentially undo that practice. We never ask what happened to you, because this can actually reactivate the patient. So there are things that we do say and that we don't say that wouldn't necessarily be the case if we were working in our private offices, in our clinics. So first and foremost, and also you may be working with people who don't speak your own language, who are in very different cultural settings than you. So there has to be a way to provide the care, the trauma-informed care, in a neutral way that doesn't activate the patient and can somehow be that bridge from you as the practitioner to them as the patient that's of benefit to them. So if you can speak the same language or even through a translator, some of the things you would not want to say would be, all right, say there's a disaster and somebody's home has been destroyed. You would never say something like, oh, I understand. You can always build a new house. That would be a no. Okay. You would never say to the person whose dog was lost in the flood, oh, you can get a new dog, or it will be better soon. Things like that. These are not appropriate things to say with people who've experienced trauma. So you want to be careful. You never want to ask the story, what the story is. You don't have to know the story. And you can ask more neutral questions that will give you clues. If you have a clue that, like, say you have somebody who comes into your office who you through the interview process of symptoms, like how's your sleep? How's your digestion? You can get clues that perhaps the person has a trauma background, because you don't know, but you don't then say, do you have trauma in your past? You would take the information that you're getting about their sleep, about their digestion, about their energy levels, and you would consider that possibly this person has some traumatic experience at the root of their problem, and you would treat appropriately using trauma-informed care principles. So this is a bit different than how we're trained to ask every question and interact with the patient compassionately as a to commiserate with the patient or say, oh, I understand. I know I've had this experience too, that kind of thing. We want to be much more neutral. And so some of the things that you could say are, if somebody's expressing grief or rage or anxiety and actually says those things to you, you can say, these are normal reactions. And it's understandable that you feel this way. Validating, listening and validating, and that's it. And the other important thing, if you don't really know what to say, is this is a safe place for you to be. Because people who have trauma backgrounds, that's the first thing they need. We go back to the trauma-informed care principles. The first thing people need is to know that they're in a safe place for treatment. And that isn't just what you say to the person, it's also how you treat them. This is why we like group acupuncture, because it's actually provides a safe container for people. If you have a trauma patient who comes to you and the first thing you do is treat them unclothed, face down, and put needles in their back as their first experience, I can guarantee you that that could be an activating experience for them. That is not necessarily a safe way to treat them initially. You have to develop rapport with them. They feel safe, and eventually you could do something like that. But that's putting the person who's got a trauma background in a very vulnerable place. And so you want to always do no harm and make sure that the person feels safe before you move to a different kind of treatment that might be more challenging for them. Okay. So this is why we like the group environment. We have very few reactivations versus discharging in group environments. And so you want to be careful. Things that you would never say, again, would be, oh, it could have been worse. Okay. Somebody had a bad experience, a traumatic experience. It could have been worse. You could have died. This is not something a trauma survivor needs to hear. Or, like I said, you can always get another car, you can always get another house, or you can always get another animal. It's best if you stay busy. Okay, that's another thing not to say. And also, don't say, I know just how you feel, because you don't. You too have had traumatic experiences, perhaps, but each person's experience is their own. And while you may think that that is a helpful thing to say, for most trauma survivors, that is not helpful to hear, that you understand them. Yes, you want them to feel safe, that they can trust you, etc. But you impart that in a different way. Or if somebody is in a chronic pattern, oftentimes you may, as a practitioner, get frustrated. You may feel like the treatment's not really working. And this is important to not get your ego invested in it. The care that you give them may only be palliative. It may only be soothing. It may not be healing, okay, in the full sense. Each person is going to have their healing journey. So the main thing is to be there, be witness, listen actively, use trauma-informed care principles to inform your work, create safety for the patient, be very transparent, be dependable. Don't add to any feeling that the patient might have a feeling ambushed, okay? Because if you say something and that doesn't happen, and then you do something different, that can be a problem for patients who have trauma patterns. And really trying as much as possible to bring an empowerment quality to your collaboration, that you're collaborating, you're the helper, you're helping re-regulate. The person is healing, you're a helper. And so that would be our advice on how you work, especially with people who are in traumatic situations. And then there's other things. Let me go back to my slideshow here because I don't want to forget my notes. Hold on. I want to talk just a second about the cultural humility piece again, because it's really important. Okay, so it's really important to educate yourself about the community you're going to work with, and that will help you bring greater trauma-informed care to that community. Again, being aware of cultural issues, how body language works in a culture, what touching means. We work a lot with refugees from the Middle East. And in those treatment situations, for example, you will rarely have men and women in the same treatment circle. You will rarely have men practitioners treating women. So you have to know all those things about the community that you're working with, providing respect, open-mindedness, even if you wouldn't necessarily agree with a cultural practice. It's not your job to make that judgment. You're bringing the healing modality to a traumatized community, and your job is to be as neutral as possible as the practitioner and as compassionate, and bring the treatment to them where they're at. Definitely do research, ask questions. I've made a million mistakes culturally in my 10 years of experience with AWB. And it's really helpful to have people this is why we always want to have community partners when we're working, so that we don't take our own biases into a community to work. We really take our medicine as a service, but we let go of our own opinion about what a community needs per se, or an individual needs, and let the treatment do what it needs to do for that person and that community. Dr. India talked about that auricular acupuncture is a great way. It does the treatment. It regulates the person and the community as they need to be. I want to go back to one other thing with working with trauma survivors. So often, because we're working with people who, often the treatment can have a powerful effect. And that powerful effect may not just look like calming down. We're not actually trying to calm somebody. We're trying to regulate. That's what we're trying to do. And sometimes regulate means to calm the person if they're in a hyper-aroused state. And in other situations, we're actually trying to bring the spirit of the person back into the body. We're trying to re-embody people who've essentially disconnected from themselves. And that's a more activating treatment, or the treatment has a more activating effect. So sometimes you'll see people calm down, and some people will actually be energized, which is great if that's what they need. Some people will discharge, meaning it will help the body move through that incomplete mobilization response that we talked about earlier. So you may see somebody actually exhibit symptoms in the treatment that may look like they're in the threat, okay? So that can be reactivation of the threatening experience, or it can be a discharge. Reactivation is not something helpful. We don't want to have people go back into re-experiencing or having flashbacks. We do invite people, if they do, to discharge. So how do you tell the difference? Okay. And I'm sure many of you have had these experiences, and maybe at the end, if you don't mind sharing any experiences you've had with patients who've either discharged physically, like crying, yawning, shaking, trembling, laughing. These are all like ways that the body discharges stress and trauma. This is helpful. Whereas reactivation, like I said, is when the person is in flashback or re-experiencing, like they think they're there, meaning that they are being threatened. They are not in present time. So the main way you know the difference, because they can look the same. You can have a person look like the vacant eyes, or trembling, or shaking, or crying, and it can look the same. The difference is that in reactivation, if you asked the person as the practitioner, if you were there with them and you put your hands on their knees and you said, "What color is my shirt?" And if they can't tell you, they're activated. They're disassociating. They're in re-experiencing. They're not present. Whereas in trauma discharge, if you asked that question to the person, they could tell you. So that's kind of the flag question. If you're really not sure what's happening with the patient during the treatment, you don't want to interrupt a discharge. You do want to interrupt an activation in a gentle, safe way, which really means approaching the patient gently, carefully, adding some level of touch typically to help bring them back into their body. So it can be putting hands on knees if they're sitting facing you in a circle, saying, "You're safe, I'm here." Feel your body, feel your knees. And you start doing a little titrated questioning, like, can you put your hands on your arms like this? Can you hug yourself? This will bring the person back into their body, and they'll usually re-regulate relatively quickly. Trauma discharge, you may bring a tissue and just put it on the person's knee and leave during the treatment. That would be an appropriate support. But you don't want to interrupt it, because this is part of how the person's moving through their incomplete mobilization response that didn't happen when they had the threat. And they'll feel re-regulated. They'll feel better at the end. So those are the things I want to say about how you work with trauma survivors. Again, really let trauma-informed care principles guide your work. That's the main thing. Okay, I'm going to move now to what's happening in the world and how we can bring this work into the world. Or we're thinking about how you can become involved if you're interested. I'm just going to show you some slides about that show how we build different kinds of community care models for trauma healing in different places. This is a picture of a circle. You can see there's children. There are children mainly in this circle. This is in a huge shelter for Central American refugees in Tijuana, Mexico, where people live in one big room. All the beds are around the side of this big auditorium. And we go with an integrative team of doctors and nurses and other kinds of health professionals to provide ear acupuncture treatments and some peripheral treatments too, like Dr. Tan or master tongue treatments in the treatment circle for pain, stress, and trauma. And as you can see, we treat a lot of children. So I don't think any of these kids got needles. They all got ear seeds. And I can tell you that children love ear seeds. And children are a little goes a long way with kids in terms of treatment. And they will often bring their parents into the treatment circle. They're curious. So they come into the treatment circle and want ear seeds. And then they go and tell their parents, and their parents come and sit down and have needles and massage and essential oils, things like that. So children are an amazing, they help connect people, older people especially, to the work in a very special way. And again, we're working directly with intervening at early ages with very adverse childhood experiences. This is the journey from Nicaragua to the Mexican border is dangerous and long, and these children have gone through it, and now they're having to wait and wait and wait, and who knows what will happen to them if they come into the United States as either illegally as undocumented people or separated from their parents. The trauma experiences are substantial. So having even just, occasional ear seed treatments is useful for helping stem the possibility of trauma patterns developing over time. This is fire relief work. Again, we've talked about that, using, setting up mobile clinics. This one up on the top here is like outside in a smoke zone. All the equipment is in a backpack. We set it up and we do ear treatments throughout the day for people who are evacuated from their homes. Here are some of the first responders who have to work really long and hard. We work with the Red Cross and other kinds of organizations in this situation. So they're our partners, and we treat their volunteers because they too have been working hard. So this is just another example of how we will create pop-up clinics, we call them mobile pop-up clinics, to bring auricular acupuncture into a disaster situation. I live in California, and California is a place where half the food of the United States is grown. Even people in the United States don't know that. Californians know it. And the people who produce our food and grow our food are farm workers, and 80% of them have no legal documentation or status in the United States. So it's a community that is vital to our well-being and our economy, and yet they have very few rights, labor rights, very little access to healthcare, very crowded, terrible living conditions. They're exposed to a lot of pesticides. They often have to move seasonally. So farm worker children, it's not uncommon for them to be in like 3 schools in a year. So we do a lot of support work with the farm worker communities in places like California and Texas, where so many farm workers who are essential workers are growing our food. And so this is like a monthly clinic we do in an alley, like a small, between houses. We never tell the location of where we're doing it because the authorities might come and try to arrest people and deport them. So we have to do it in a thoughtful way. We do it with community partners who support farm workers. We never do this by ourselves. And then here's another. So these are farm workers in the Central Valley part of California. This is actually a vineyard because we have, as some of you know, we have very good wine in California. And so the farm workers are the ones who grow the grapes and harvest the grapes. And So we do a lot of clinics in the vineyards for the workers in the different wineries. And this is we do massage and we do acupuncture, and it's a really great way to support farm workers in their workplace. So again, mobile clinics, pop-up clinics outside, and which is really good for COVID. Here now we're in more of an embedded situation. This is I mentioned them before, the midwives that we work with in Tijuana, again, with Central Americans and Haitian refugees, even Ukrainian refugees have been coming to Tijuana to cross into the United States. And so we do, here's where we do more than nada. We do full body acupuncture. We have a whole herbal pharmacy. So here's where we can use lots of the modalities that we've talked about in this presentation, more than just ear acupuncture. And we always treat the midwives that we're with because they work really hard. They deliver all the babies in the refugee community in Tijuana, which is probably, it's at least 500 babies a year because there's no other place for the women to have their babies. So it's a really amazing clinic. It's a really amazing integrative medicine experience of biomedicine, indigenous medicine, East Asian medicine, and it's a long-term project. Okay, another mobile clinic situation. After Hurricane Maria, we worked a lot in Puerto Rico. We're still working in Puerto Rico. And here you can see we're in a sitting down circle situation, but we're doing peripheral points here because a lot of people have a lot of pain problems after, in these kinds of disaster situations. They're carrying their children, they're carrying all their animals, they're carrying their supplies so that they wouldn't get washed away. So many people had a lot of pain problems, not just trauma experience. This is one of our teams that, worked for 10 days every day, providing services because there weren't enough acupuncturists in Puerto Rico. So we did a lot of direct service of people coming from the United States who were well trained to support the practitioners in Puerto Rico. And we worked with some of the NADA practitioners from New York City as well, who came to Puerto Rico to help. I mentioned earlier that we work in Haiti. We've worked there since the earthquake in 2009, and Haiti was a place, or 2010, Haiti was a place where there were no acupuncturists at that time. So I think we did 6 service trips or maybe 8, but we started training local people to do NADA by the time we went on like our 6th or 7th trip. And we've trained 5 groups of Haitian practitioners who are either mental health workers or nurses or medical assistants to do NADA. This is Luis Santalcid, who's been the director or coordinator of our work there for 10 years. And this was recently, there was an earthquake recently, and this is his group, 2 of them, with a group of young people who they treated post-earthquake several months ago. Again, another place we do mobile clinics is in Palestinian villages. I talked about how we work in Israel and Palestine. We're not just doing treatments, but we're making sure that we train people and we do our work as much as possible with mixed teams of people, meaning Palestinian, American, Israeli practitioners working together on a team to provide support to people. And this is a very powerful medicine of peace, which is what we call our work, medicine of peace practice, to actually be an example of how people from very different perspectives and very different narratives and very different traumatic narratives can come together and provide treatment to everybody. In 2015, as so many people were coming out of Afghanistan and Syria because of the wars there, as many of you know, in Germany accepted the most refugees of any country in the EU. And so the people who who didn't make it over the Greek border in 2016 before they closed it, because there were so many refugees that came before them, essentially got stuck in Greece. So when we started working there, I think there were 50 camps, 50 refugee camps, and about 65,000 people who were in the camps. And so we started working in the camps in that year. We trained a number of Greek acupuncturists, and worked in the camps, several camps for 2 years. We have an ongoing program in Greece. We don't work in camps anymore. Now we work in more transitional support centers for refugees in places like Athens. And we work particularly with women and children. And here again, we're doing more than just ear acupuncture. This is body. We're doing Tui Na. We do a lot of Tui Na with the kids. And we teach parents how to do massage on their children. We teach the tapping technique, those kinds of other somatic practices. And now I want to talk just for a minute about what's happening now with Ukrainian refugees, which, as most of you know, I think there are about 12 million people inside of Ukraine who are displaced inside the country from the war zones that are currently active. And about over 5 million people have come out of Ukraine and are in, obviously, places like Germany and throughout the EU and UK. And like I said, even in Tijuana, coming into the United States, going to Israel, different parts of the world. So what we've done as our current work is help both mentor and train local practitioners to set up teams in the countries where Ukrainian refugees are coming to. So here's an example: Netherlands, different clinics that have been going on in the last couple of months. I think we have 8 different cities in the Netherlands that have clinics regularly operating for Ukrainian refugees to come and get treatment. And what I think is also interesting is they're starting to actually invite people from some of the other migrations, previous migrations like Syria and Afghanistan, to also come into the treatment circle. So this is good that people from previous migrations are also being supported more at a higher level now with the Ukrainians. So this is an example of what's happening in Ukraine. I can tell you in Germany that where, you know, there's such a strong NADA component of practice, that there are different practitioners in Germany doing Ukraine support work. There's a new project that's starting in Munich, which is really going to provide more than just NADA. It's going to be, I think there's a chiropractor and an osteopath who's part of the team. So a lot's happening in places like UK, Netherlands, Germany. Here's on the left is Norway. There's an active clinic now in Oslo and some new ones that are going to start in other parts of Norway. In Poland, where so many refugees are currently residing, it's a much more difficult place to set up clinics because of the governmental regulations. There's a lot of concern, which is understandable, about how to protect the refugee population from trafficking. This is common in refugee disaster situations, and particularly because Ukrainian migration is comprised of so many women and children. There are very strong safeguards that are being created by the Polish government and the health ministry to make sure that people are safe. So that's a good thing. And it's also harder than if NGOs like AWB want to go and offer services. It's very hard to penetrate the gatekeeping, we call it. But some of our practitioner colleagues there have been able to work with individual physicians to provide treatments. This is a treatment in the hospital. The patient had to jump from a window that was being bombed and she was paralyzed. And so the acupuncture treatment is, the doctors have asked our colleagues to go in and treat people orthopedically with these kinds of injuries with a lot of success. So that's another really great way that our medicine can be useful in these kinds of very traumatic situations. Here's Ukrainian refugee treatments in Romania. This is one of the first shelters that we worked in, shelter situations we worked in on the right. It was a big 5-star hotel that became a refugee center very early in the war. And actually our Greek practitioners that we trained went to Romania and did tons of ear seed treatments, particularly taught the parents how to put ear seeds on their kids. Even if they were only in transit and going to other places, they were, had ear seeds with them that they could provide to their children. And then the Greek practitioners actually trained the Romanian practitioners, like Adriana on the left, a doctor from Romania, to do NADA. And so that's happening on an ongoing basis in Bucharest. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say, India. Before I let you, or I hand the baton to you, let me just say that if any of you are interested in either participating in some current activities in the EU or in any country that you're in, we can definitely direct you to people who are working in your countries with refugees right now or other traumatized communities. So at the end of this presentation, you'll have our emails, and you can write me an email and I will connect you or follow up with you. So I just wanted to invite you to consider starting something in your own community or join a team that's already working perhaps in your community or in your country to put these trauma healing tools to work in action, because the world needs you. So, India, are you there? I don't see her.
Okay, there I go.
There you are.
I was unmuted.
Okay, self-care.
Yeah, so this is a really important topic that has so much to do about the background of the quality of care that we're going to be able to deliver in these very heightened settings. So self-care is really about not burning out, right? We really want to take heed and recognize that that the mission of addressing the needs, the trauma-based needs of our communities at large as practitioners is definitely going to require some intense self-care practices. So we want to offer just some information about what that is, what it should look like, and just some terminology that can help you better understand why this is really an essential ingredient to you delivering a very high quality of care. So we have these terms, which are secondary trauma. One of the key points here is this notion of being an indirect witness. So secondary traumatization refers to the effects of working with people who have experienced trauma and absorbing the traumatic stories they share. So I'm going to speak to this as a practitioner of Reiki, which as a acupuncturist, I was definitely one who absorbed. When I came into the Reiki training, I then learned how to still deliver a quality of presence, but not to a degree of absorbing that was debilitating, and showing up more compassionately. So this is something that you may want to be aware of as an indirect witness you don't want to be a secondary trauma victim to the stories that are being told to you, and the practices that you have to recalibrate and kind of mitigate, but without being disconnected, is going to be really important for how you can show up and deliver the type of quality care that's needed. Secondary trauma is a slow, cumulative process that occurs over the course of hearing many personal stories of tragedy, loss, and pain. This makes its effects difficult to detect because you're not really sure where it's coming from. Often, helping professionals, like all of us, do not realize that they are suffering from secondary traumatization until they are already burnt out. So coming into this work, it is really important to understand your own bodily sensations and your own bodily communication to understand whether or not the accumulative effects of being exposed to the traumas and the stories and the scenarios is starting to ease its way into your own energy system. Working in this field is emotionally very evocative, and the work is very evocative. Many staff are exposed to stories of trauma on a frequent basis, and that may challenge their capacity to do their own self-regulating. So reflective supervision and appropriate boundaries are important pieces of information that you will need that is necessary to do this work and to prevent re-traumatization within your own energy system. So some have found therapy to be a supportive tool to promote self-care and reduce the impact of vicarious secondary trauma. I personally have utilized tools very similar to my own heart math that was demonstrated in the beginning, but an awareness of my own energetic regulation before going into a therapeutic environment. I found that to be a very effective tool to allow my system to be regulated so that I'm already coming in with an awareness that I'm regulated. So coming out of that, I have a sensory understanding of if I was impacted to any degree. The effects of secondary traumatization, like the effect of trauma itself, can be quite serious and can be quite permanent. So at a minimum, it can interfere with our ability to do our job effectively. It is important to learn to recognize, to monitor, and to minimize the impact of secondary traumatization in our lives. So preventative practices, your self-care practices, your watering practices are going to be really key here in preventing this type of residual effect. So what are some signs and symptoms that you may be experiencing secondary trauma? How do you know when you go from having a normal reaction to having a reaction that indicates you are experiencing secondary trauma? So secondary vicarious trauma requires intervention and management once it gets to that level. So some key points here are to be aware of the symptoms of secondary trauma. You would express things that are intensified, such as like a profound sadness, profound grief, profound anger that you may recognize is something that you didn't have prior to an experience. These are all normal reactions to a degree when you hear an emotional story. But you may not want to leave the scene until the work is finished in general, right? As a therapist responding. You will likely try to override stress and fatigue with dedication and commitment. So you'll kind of push through and override the need to recalibrate. You may deny the need for rest and recovery. That could be also an indicator. So some other possible symptoms that you should be aware of secondary trauma, just fatigue, general fatigue. That's a tall tale sign that the system needs to regulate, is just the inability to recuperate your energy. Sometimes overwhelmed by needs of the community, feeling overwhelmed by the demands of the community at large, unable to function in a day-to-day situation, which requires you to make decisions, and it becomes hard to make day-to-day decisions. Simply not taking care of yourself in any capacity could also be a sign of secondary trauma. The irritabilities that you may carry, the annoyances, and then withdrawal as a response to those triggers. Difficulty communicating your thoughts, incomprehension, difficulty remembering instructions, difficulty with maintaining your balance or some level of equilibrium, being very combative or argumentative or deflective. These are all characteristic traits of you possibly absorbing some of the energies that you're being exposed to, and it now causing a secondary trauma within your own body. If you find that you're having a limited attention span, right? Because sometimes in these environments, we're really needed to be patient beyond our own understanding. Tunnel vision, a muffled kind of hearing, unusual clumsiness is another way of detecting that there's some additional energies on board that may not be yours. Cold and flu-like symptoms, obviously, that's a decrease in the immune system and the ability to fight off just basic, viral or bacterial invaders. Disorientation, confusion, difficulty concentrating. So you kind of get the gist of it. When you yourself are feeling off balance, that is an indicator that you may need to come back to center, recalibrate, care for yourself, water yourself, and start to employ some of your own self-care practices, because it becomes now a point where you're offering care and aid from a deficient place, right? Or from a very overwhelmed place, which really doesn't help. Does it look like what we might call burnout? So secondary vicarious trauma will require some form of intervention and management. So cognitive disruptions associated with burnout can be limited to work conditions, while the effects of vicarious trauma have a much wider definition in terms of its scope. So again, we just want you to have some awareness of some of the signs and symptoms that may be present in this type of work, in the nature of trauma work. So we have here a preventing secondary trauma and trauma reactivation with these two words that we'll leave you with, called HALT and SHEN. So HALT is an awareness of being hungry, angry, lonely, tired. HALT. And if you are any of those statuses, you may have a greater tendency towards secondary trauma or a trauma reactivation. So this is what we mean by self-care in these events, in these situations of trauma-informed practices. You eating is very important, making time for nourishment, making time to check in with your own emotional state, ensuring that you're tending to your own social needs and rest, obviously, right? Because again, that will also make you very vulnerable to just the nature of the severity of energies that may be on board in a trauma environment, trauma-induced environment. SHEN is an acronym, stands for sleep, hydration, exercise, nutrition. Again, these are types of self-care regimens. Sleep, baseline, very, very foundational to ensuring that you are taking care of yourself. Hydration is another, making sure that your body is totally and well hydrated throughout this work is something that you really need to pay attention to. because we know there's a cascade of signs and symptoms that can come from dehydration. Exercise, if possible, I would definitely have your own protocol of being able to exercise your body, to engage your body, to move the blood, the lymph, the tissues, so that again, you're energizing yourself, you're taking care of yourself, and you're bringing these tools to the different locations, right? It doesn't matter where you go, you can still do your exercises and take care of yourself in different environments. And last but not least, nutrition, right? We need to constantly continue to replenish ourselves. That's that earth principle, that spleen principle. We need to constantly rebalance, recalibrate, but also through replenishment and nourishment. So HALT and Shen, hopefully those two will be useful in helping to prevent secondary trauma. And Shen, also be mindful that if you're taking care of that, there's less of a tendency towards secondary trauma and the reactivation of trauma in your body. So we want to also advise in this beautiful picture that we're showing here of everyone pausing, taking time to eat in a community setting, very earthly, that trauma-informed self-care really does require collective effort. And in addition to this, it blends the individual needs and the collective health as well. So we found that it's essential to add trauma-informed principles to our self-care toolbox as we work with people impacted by acute and chronic intergenerational trauma. Trauma-informed self-care practices will include the list that we have here, which are setting boundaries, having trauma training, ongoing trauma training, trigger awarenesses, being aware of what triggers you have, your own stress management, your own toolbox for how you move stress out of your body. Obviously, work-life balance in these acute situations, even though they may be of high demand, we still need to be checking in with what a work-life balance has. We all may not have the same capacity to deliver care. So really being mindful of what your own individual capacity is really important. And last but not least, the restoration of your physical, mental, and spiritual health. You are fully allowed and encouraged to bring your restorative practices, your mental practices, and your spiritual practices to these environments, because the more you are self-tending to those things, the more the higher the quality of care that you can potentially deliver. And I absolutely love this picture here, as everyone is smiling and very happy. Okay, so why do we need trauma-informed care and self-care practices? To avoid secondary trauma. Again, we just really want to drive that home to understand that you actually can re-trigger or cause secondary trauma within your own body. And we want to work long-term. We want to sustain this work, right? So how can we do that? We have to have certain replenishment protocols in effect. And that definitely goes back into the individual practitioners in terms of the more we care for ourselves and each other as a community, the longer we can sustain ourselves in this type of work. And to be, and to serve ourselves, to be our best selves, to serve our communities and our patients as well. It is going to be most effective when we are taking care of ourselves, our patients, our communities. So what does trauma-informed self-care look like, practically speaking? That's something I'd love for you to expound on. What would that look like for you? If you were going to another country or working with AWB away from your home base, what would that look like for your individual needs? So here's an expanded definition of self-care. Self-care is anything that you give that gives you a way to reconnect with yourself and your community in a meaningful, long-term way that nurtures our individual welfare and gives us the power to survive and continue to do the collective work. So even in that definition, it really is is potent in wanting to give a sustenance in a continued capacity to this work. So we really want you to be extremely mindful of the self-care principle of this work, as that is really the common denominator of how much we're going to be able to deliver. So as we continue our exploration of self-care strategies, and in this course, we'd like you to use more expansive definitions, expound on this definition, and so that we can employ self-care as a common denominator in how practitioners show up in this type of work. Self-care is anything that gives you that ability to reconnect and to ground, most importantly, and to be fully present and integrated into the space. So again, we can't emphasize enough that the world needs you. There's 8 C's that we'd like to share: care, self-care, and compassion, competence and confidence, cultural humility and curiosity, and lastly, community and collaboration. So we really hope that this course has given you some new ideas, some new tools that you can use to serve your patients and bring trauma healing into your practices, into your communities, and that you can feel confident that there are tools available for you to actually do this. The world needs all of us, and we are more now than ever in need. And we invite you to join us, join AWB, so that we can build more trauma healing projects here in the US, internationally, and collectively.
Thanks, India. And I want to thank everybody who's come. These are our emails, Dr. India's and mine, if you want to contact us, and our website, which really has a lot of information on it. You can do training courses, some of which are free, some of which are for a modest price. We have a 5-part certificate program, which is 75 hours of really detailed trauma training. We have courses on things like aromatherapy, ethics, how do you treat people safely in a pandemic, lots of different courses. And if you join AWB as a member, that helps support this work in the world. So we invite you to join us. Please feel free to write us. And we have like 3 minutes for questions, it looks like. So I apologize that we don't have a lot of time, but let me see if this question's in the chat box. Oh, yeah, that's one thing. Thank you for this reminder. Next weekend, I know it's a holiday weekend in Berlin or in Germany. We're actually doing a live training in Berlin, and the information is, it's a 2-day workshop, and there's an online, actually it's a 3-day training, and there's an online version of it, and it will be taped. So if you're interested in getting a much more detailed, kind of more in-depth version of this training that we presented today, please go to our website and look at our Berlin training information. We'd love to have you. And I think with that, do we have any burning questions? And if you don't, or you think of some later, you can always write to either Dr. India or myself with questions. But does anybody have anything they'd like to ask in the remaining 2 minutes we have left? Okay, well, with that, I think we'll say goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen. Ciao.